Welcome to the show, Congresswoman Plaskett.
Thanks for having me.
So the House passed a bill on Friday that would increase food stamp benefits, SNAP benefits. Can you tell us what's in the bill and why the House did that?
Well, I think what was important in this bill was that the House Democrats, first of all, wanted to set down a marker. In the last CARES Act that was passed by Congress, the original bill originated in the Senate and involved a lot of negotiation, but was not a bill that really addressed so many of the issues that we believe American people were most interested in. There was a lot of blowback, I think, that came from America on the amount of money that went to large businesses rather than small. And so this bill is an attempt to really address those working class Americans and those who are in desperate need right now. And one of those areas is, of course, SNAP, is, of course, food and food supplies going to the most neediest of Americans. And we believe that while the number is large, that this amount of funding is really fundamental to ensure that Americans continue to be able to eat during the pandemic.
So it seems unlikely that the bill as passed by the House is going to pass the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
Given that, is
Mhm.
there something that you and the House can do to help these needy Americans?
I think that we have done quite a bit. And now it's necessary, the Farm Bill, which people think is specifically for farmers, also has a very large nutrition component in it. And when we passed the Farm Bill in the last Congress, almost 2 years ago, one of the main areas we attempted to address was the USDA's need for standing up a food distribution component that could address issues like we have today. And so while the bill in its form right now, the HEROES Act, may not be what is eventually passed by the Senate and sent to the president, we believe that it is, one, a strong statement, and in the interim period, we are working to ensure that the Department of Agriculture, Secretary Perdue, lives up to USDA's promises to the American people that were in the Farm Bill. So as you saw, we're working on food boxes, on rerouting and supporting food distribution so that the farmers who are growing our food get those food to the neediest Americans right now, that being primarily food banks. We know that there were problems in the initial part of the pandemic with regard to that, despite having received the funding in the Farm Bill to have the funding to stand up a food distribution plan in the most neediest times like we are in now. And so we know that the Department of Agriculture, through the work of Chairman Colin Peterson and other members really pressing them, are doing that now. Now we know that there are some questions on how the contracts have been awarded, and we are making inquiries right now on making sure that those who have the contracts are doing what is required of them, and if not, for them to be removed and the right people put in place.
You mentioned the food distribution issue. We've seen the lines of Americans waiting for food bank distributions. And at the same time, we hear about rotting food and food that's not able to get to market. So you mentioned a problem with the distribution early in the pandemic. Is there reason to believe that that's going to get better? That food from farmers that would otherwise be going to waste is going to reach those food banks?
Well, the Agriculture Department has awarded multi-million-dollar contracts to companies to be able to do that. Late last week, USDA outlined for us some $1.2 billion in federal contracts for a program to be able to change that food distribution program, to do more to respond to the supply chain issues that you're talking about and the disruption. Farmers are growing food, and they were growing food with not the pandemic in mind, with the notion that they were going to be giving these foods to hotels, to restaurants, and to the normal distribution places that they had been. And because there is not those end users to get the food to, it became overly costly for them as farmers to get it to these food banks, or for the normal distribution channels to do it. And so that's where the federal government needs to step in. That's our belief on my side of the aisle, that it's the federal government's job to do that. And so we're really pushing USDA, who now has the money to do this, upwards of $1 billion to get food to Americans who need it, rather than it's not going overseas like it had in the past. And, I'm hopeful that they're going to get it done as quickly as possible. Everyone forgets that USDA, the Department of Agriculture, is the largest agency in the federal government, responsible for, doing tremendous work overseas in terms of food supplies and food distributions. And we're asking them to do it here on the home front, here in America. And I know on my committee on biotech and research and horticulture, we're making sure that our farmers can continue growing and that the food that they're growing can get to the people who need it most.
Now, in normal times, schools are a major source for food distribution. Low-income children can get up to 2 meals a day at school.
Correct.
Schools closed. We know that school districts are trying to innovate in the way that they distribute food. They're trying to enable families to get food without having to come to a congregate feeding site.
Mm-hmm.
We have summer around the corner here. Are people thinking about how to continue food distribution during those summer months?
Well, I think that there are some jurisdictions where school lunch programs go on even in the summer, because we know that children who need food during the school year don't stop going hungry when the summer months come. And so we're hoping to expand that problem. The new USDA program called the Farmers Families Food Box Program is slated to spend about $300 million each month on US food products, and those getting to food banks, to nonprofits, and to others. And we're talking with stakeholders in this to make sure that there's a connection between the nonprofits, the food banks, and the school districts to ensure that children are continuing to be fed during these summer months. Many schools, districts are, some are, of course, cutting the school year short, and some are expanding the school year because of lost time that they believe the young children have had. And so we want not just the students, but the families to be able to have food during this time period. This has been an ongoing fight in the Agriculture Committee about feeding people most needy. I can't imagine why we argue about it, but we do, whether it's our responsibility or not. The fact that we are such a wealthy nation, that we have farmers who have the ability to export so many goods around the world, and yet there are millions of Americans that goes hungry, is just inexcusable, my belief. And remember that the school lunch program was started after World War II, when we saw that our soldiers were not strong enough, that they didn't have bone density, because so many of them lacked nutrition when they were growing. And that was what started the original school lunch programs. And we want Americans to not only to be physically strong, but mentally strong. We know that that's tied to nutrition. If we're going to continue to be the nation of innovation, the nation that leads, we've got to feed each other. That's a basic necessity. And so I'm doing everything I can, and so many of my colleagues are doing and pressing the Department of Agriculture to make sure that that happens.
Now, there's a lot of poverty in the Virgin Islands, the district that you represent.
Yes.
The islands are very reliant on tourism. Tourism, of course, is not happening right now. What's the situation there?
Well, thanks so much for asking that. You're correct. 40%, more than 40% of children in the Virgin Islands live in poverty. And 100% of children in our public schools are eligible for school lunch programs. And so we know that that's vitally important to continue. Our economy also has been decimated by the pandemic because of our reliance on tourism. More than a third of our economy is based on tourism. And so we really have issues with ensuring that we are going to be able to make payroll, to continue with government functions. My understanding is that we have less than a working week of cash on hand for the government to be able to continue to meet those basic operations. And so, I'm hopeful that one of the things that the HEROES Act included was economic funding going to the states, localities, municipalities to be able to meet their economic need. And what I've asked our local government and our legislature is that when we receive this funding, let's not just plow it into general fund, but let's think creatively about how we continue to diversify our economy so that we do not fall prey to people's disposable incomes. If our hotels, cruise ships, airlift is not there, we've got to find ways to grow our economy. We've got to maybe become the innovators in renewable energies in the Caribbean. We have the ability to be able to go to, we have the ability to be able to be in financial services sector. We have in the Virgin Islands, on the island of St. Croix, the greatest bandwidth capacity of anywhere in the Western Hemisphere and the United States, aside from New York City, even more than Silicon Valley, because Global Crossing put their hub between South America and North America on the shores of the Virgin Islands. So to be able to track data storage, data mining on our island is something that I believe is the future for us, and our ability to really show America's strength in the Caribbean. So often our State Department, our presidents are trying to get Caribbean nations to support issues that they have in the Organization of American States or in the United Nations. And they look to see how does America treat its own in the Caribbean, and that has been lacking both in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. And this is an opportunity for America to utilize the Virgin Islands as a testing case for what can be done to diversify our economy.
Would you like to see travel to the islands begin soon? I mean, what's your thinking on that, on restarting tourism?
Right, well, our governor has said that the hotels will open on June 1st. We have limited airlift going on right now, which is primarily related to people who must travel. When I came back to DC for this last action in the House, the planes were pretty empty when we're used to having 2 and 3 flights a day on St. Thomas, at least 2, sometimes 3, depending on the day of the week on St. Croix. So, it's almost a chicken and an egg, Sean, where the hoteliers were saying we need more airlift to justify building more hotels. And the airlines are saying you need to have more beds to justify more airlift coming into the island. So I'm hoping that we can have a confluence of that. Our governor has said June 1st. We have thankfully, had not as many cases per capita as other places in the United States and less deaths. However, I know that part of that is due to the lack of the prevalence of testing that is being done in the Virgin Islands as well as the rest of the United States.
How will you manage if there is no aid from Washington coming to the territories? Senator McConnell has expressed a lot of reluctance about giving more aid to localities, states, and I presume territories as well.
Well, we've been through worse than this, and we always attempt to rise. I'm always try to remind my colleagues in Washington that there is no place as small but as strong as the Virgin Islands, the things that we've given to this nation with as little that have been given to us. I think that if they would just put us in the same level of funding, remove the caps and the block grants that we receive, and treat us in formulas in the same way as states, you would see us grow. And
you're still suffering from the hurricane that happened 2 years ago.
Listen, we are still waiting. Congress did an amazing job in appropriating funding for the hurricanes. My office, my team worked incredibly hard to ensure that the Virgin Islands had access to not just billions of dollars, but a fundamental change in the Stafford Act that allows us to rebuild as we should be, rather than as we were at the time of the storm. It was a recognition by Congress of the inequities in funding prior to the storm that put us in the position where our infrastructure absolutely was decimated after those 2 Category 5 hurricanes. However, this administration has really slow walked and put up guidelines and barriers that was not the intent of Congress initially. And I've had agreement that by both Republicans and Democrats that the way that the administration is rolling out the funding, the barriers that they're putting up was not the intent of Congress in passing that legislation. And so, you know, we'll continue to fight and to advocate. In the meantime, listen, that's why we're thanking God that we don't have as many cases as we have, because we do not have the beds nor the personnel in our hospital system, in our healthcare system, to be able to handle that. I mean, we lost our hospitals, more than 50% damage FEMA has agreed to on the island of St. Croix, and completely destroyed our cancer center as well as parts of the hospital on St. Thomas. The clinic on St. John also decimated. And on St. Croix, with more than 50% damage, we're still waiting now 3 years later for the temporary facility to be agreed on and put up before they begin construction on a permanent one. Those are the kinds of things that people living in the territories, people who you know, my ancestors, my grandparents went to Congress and demanded that we be part of the draft as members of this American, you know, part of this American experience, and wanting to have the responsibility of being Americans without the full benefits therein.
Delegate, we appreciate you joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and take care, and you be safe.
You too.